There is a particular kind of theft that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come through a broken window or a kicked door. It doesn't leave marks on the frame or glass on the floor. It comes quietly, in the middle of ordinary days, dressed in the language of helpfulness and practicality and reason. It comes from people who know exactly which rooms you aren't watching, and exactly when you'll be too tired or too grief-stricken or too trusting to notice the weight of what has left your hands. I've thought about this for a long time now, longer than I probably should have, and what I've come to believe is that the theft itself, the act, the moment, the decision someone makes to take what isn't theirs, that's almost never the real story. The real story is always what was there before it. What was built, what was tended, what was quietly, carefully protected while the person doing the protecting had no idea protection was even necessary. My wife Margaret kept a cedar box on the top shelf of our bedroom closet. She'd had it since before I knew her. Pale wood, brass hinges, a small tarnished latch. She never locked it. She didn't think she needed to. She was right about most things. She was wrong about that. But the cedar box is not where this story ends. It's only where it begins to matter. My name is Gerald Raymond Holt. I turned 63 years old on a Tuesday in February, which I mention only because I spent that birthday in a hospital corridor on the 4th floor of St. Catherine's Medical Center in Dearborn, Michigan, eating a vending machine sandwich and reading the same paragraph of a paperback novel 6 times without absorbing a single word. I'd been a machinist for 31 years. Started on the floor at Alderman Industrial when I was 22, worked my way into quality control, eventually into floor supervision. I wasn't the loudest man in any room I ever entered. Never needed to be. I learned early that the men who talked the most about the work they were going to do were usually the ones you had to follow behind and finish for. I preferred to be the other kind. Margaret used to say I had 2 speeds. Steady and steadier. She meant it as a compliment and I took it as one. We were married 31 years in April. She was a dental hygienist for 20 of those years, then stayed home when our son Daniel was in middle school and never quite went back. Not because she couldn't but because she found she preferred the garden and the church auxiliary and the particular unhurried rhythm of a life she'd chosen deliberately. Margaret was not a woman who drifted into things. Every choice she made was made on purpose. The jewelry was her mother's, mostly. Some pieces were her grandmother's. A strand of freshwater pearls. A gold bracelet with a small sapphire inset that had belonged to her Aunt Carol, who died in 1987. A pair of diamond stud earrings, not large, not flashy, that I had given her on our 10th anniversary, which I'd saved for across the better part of 18 months without telling her what I was saving for. She'd cried when she opened the box. Not dramatically, just 2 quiet tears, one from each eye, which was the most emotion I'd ever seen her give to a gift. She wore those earrings to church. She wore them to Daniel's college graduation. She wore them the day our grandson Marcus was born. She kept everything in the cedar box. She'd shown it to me years ago. Gone through each piece, told me the story behind it, where it came from, who had worn it. Not because I asked. Because she wanted me to know. Because she was that kind of woman. The kind who made sure the people she loved understood the value of things before she was no longer there to explain it herself. I didn't understand at the time that she was also making a record. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in September. Stage 3. The oncologist, a calm and precise man named Dr. Elliot Farrow, sat across from us in a consultation room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and gave us the information in the measured, organized way you give people information when you've given it many times before and have learned that clarity is kinder than softness. We drove home on a Thursday afternoon in the kind of flat gray October light that makes Michigan feel like the whole state is holding its breath. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of my F-150, a 2019 Ram, actually dark blue, which she always called my F-150 no matter how many times I corrected her. And she looked out the window at the passing houses, the orange leaves coming down, and she said, "Well, we'll handle it." That was Margaret. She began treatment in October. Chemotherapy first, then a surgical consultation, then more chemotherapy. I drove her to every appointment. I sat in every waiting room. I learned the names of every nurse on the oncology floor, and I brought coffee for the overnight staff on Tuesdays because I noticed the Tuesday shift seemed to run short. I did not consider any of this extraordinary. I considered it Tuesday. Daniel, our son, was 40 years old and lived 26 minutes from our house in a 4-bedroom home in Canton. He visited on weekends sometimes. When he visited, he sat in the living room and talked about the difficulty of the drive and the busyness of his week. His wife, Renata Holt, née Souza, visited less frequently. She had opinions about hospitals, about germs, about the particular emotional labor of being present in difficult circumstances. She voiced these opinions freely. Margaret never said a word against her. I watched and I said very little, and I filed things quietly away in the place where I file things. The cedar box became important on a Wednesday, March 3rd, 8:47 in the morning. I know this because I had just returned from dropping Margaret at her 8:30 infusion appointment and was back home to change a shirt before returning to sit with her. And I walked past the open bedroom door and noticed the closet was open. Not unusual in itself. But the shelf where the cedar box lived had a different quality of light on it. A specific kind of emptiness. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to the closet and looked at the shelf. The box was gone. I checked the shelf below. I checked the floor of the closet. I opened the drawer of Margaret's nightstand, the top drawer of her dresser, the shelf in the bathroom where she sometimes put things temporarily. I did this carefully, methodically, without urgency, because I was not yet fully believing what I already understood. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a moment. Renata had been at the house the previous Saturday. She'd come alone. Daniel working, she'd said, and she'd spent approximately 90 minutes here while I drove Marcus to his basketball practice. She'd offered. I'd been grateful. I'd handed her the house key from the hook by the garage door and driven away. I called her at 9:03 in the morning. She answered on the third ring. Gerald, is everything okay? Fine, I said. I have a question. Did you notice a cedar box in the bedroom closet when you were here Saturday? A pause. Not a long one, but the kind of pause that has content in it. Oh, she said. Yes. Actually, I meant to tell you. I found a buyer for some of the jewelry. Mrs. Peretti at the antique shop on Belleville Road offered a really fair price, and I knew Margaret wouldn't want them just sitting there with everything going on. She would have wanted us to make things easier. You know how she is. She said it in the present tense. She would have wanted. As if she knew. I held the phone against my ear and I looked at the wall across from me and I said, How much? 2,200, she said. I was going to give you half. I kept the other half for the driving and the time coordinating everything. I thought it was fair. She thought it was fair. I said, I see. She said, I hope that's okay. I really did think it's what Margaret would want. I said, I'll talk to you soon, Renata. And I hung up. I sat there for perhaps 4 minutes. The room was very quiet. The heat clicked on somewhere in the house, ran for 30 seconds, clicked off. Outside, 2 houses down, someone was running a snowblower even though there was barely an inch on the ground. Then I got up, changed my shirt, and drove back to St. Catherine's to sit with my wife. I did not tell Margaret. I never told Margaret. That was a decision I made in those 4 minutes on the edge of the bed, and I have never once reconsidered it. I parked on level 2 of the hospital garage, the same spot I always used because it was closest to the elevator and the elevator nearest to the oncology floor. I sat in the truck for a moment before going in. I am not a man given to emotional episodes. I want to be honest about that, not as a point of pride, but as a simple fact of how I'm constructed. My father was the same way. He used to say that feelings were information, not instructions. You take the information in, you assess it, you decide what it means for what you're going to do next. You don't perform them. You don't broadcast them. You work with them. I took stock of what I had. My wife was on the 4th floor receiving a chemical drip designed to fight a cancer that had, according to the most recent scan, shown modest but measurable response. She was fighting. She needed to fight without the weight of this. Her daughter-in-law had walked into our home with a key I'd handed her in good faith and removed property that was not hers, sold it to a second-hand shop on Belleville Road for $2,200, and kept half for what she described as her time and effort. The items sold, I would verify this later, included the pearl strand, the sapphire bracelet, and at least 3 other pieces whose origin I would spend the next several weeks carefully reconstructing from photographs and Margaret's own descriptions. She had kept a small notebook, as it turned out. a brown leather notebook in the drawer of her vanity, with each piece listed in her handwriting, where it came from, what it meant. I found it 2 weeks after that morning. I had not lost the diamond earrings. Those were in Margaret's ears at that moment, for floors above me. She almost never removed them. I went upstairs. I sat in the chair beside her bed. I held her hand. She was reading a novel. She always brought a novel. And she looked at me over the top of it when I sat down and said, "You took your time." "Traffic," I said. She gave me the look she always gave me when she knew I was simplifying. Then she went back to her book. I didn't call Renata back that day, or the next. I let the silence be its own message, or let her think it wasn't a message at all. I'm not sure which. Either way, I used the time. I called a man named Phil Garretson, who had done estate work for Margaret's family after her mother passed. I asked him a simple question about personal property and estate documentation. He gave me a simple answer. Then he gave me the name of a woman in his office who handled asset documentation, and I made an appointment. I did not move quickly. I moved correctly. Before I go any further, if this story is sitting with you the way it sat with me, if something in it feels familiar or close or simply true, I'd ask you to hit that like button right now. Costs you nothing, and it means this story finds the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. Every week there's a new story here. Real lives, quiet dignity, permanent consequences. And drop a comment. I genuinely like to know where you're watching from. The community in this comment section has become something I didn't expect, and I read more of them than you'd think. Now, back to Gerald. Margaret's condition stabilized through April, then worsened in May. The cancer had responded to the first protocol but developed resistance and Dr. Farrow introduced a second-line treatment with the same measured honesty he'd applied to everything else. We had, he said, options. He listed them. We discussed them. Margaret listened carefully, asked 2 precise questions, and then asked me what I thought. I told her what I thought. I always told her what I thought when she asked. What I didn't tell her was what I was building in the hours she slept. Phil Garrettson's colleague, a woman named Diane Osei, was thorough in the specific way that good legal professionals are thorough, which is to say she was interested not just in the current state of things but in the paper record of how things had gotten there. She asked me, in our first meeting, to describe Margaret's estate in plain terms. What existed, what was documented, what had been discussed but not yet formalized. I told her about the house, paid off since 2019, titled jointly. I told her about the retirement accounts, the modest investment account, the truck. And I told her about the jewelry. I told her all of it, including what had happened in March. Diane Osei wrote things down without changing expression. When I finished, she put her pen down and said, "Did you take any action after the items were removed?" I said, "I called the antique shop on Belleville Road." She looked at me. I identified myself, I said, and asked if they'd recently purchased a collection of estate jewelry from a woman named Renata Holt. The owner, a man named Carl Peretti, confirmed the transaction. He had a receipt. He was cooperative. I asked if any items remained unsold. He said 3 pieces were still in the case. "Did you purchase them back?" she asked. I did. $740. She wrote that down. "And the rest?" "Gone," I said. "I have photographs." Margaret kept a handwritten inventory in a notebook. "I have that too." Diane Osei looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating slightly. Then she said, "You've been documenting this." "Since March 4th, I said. "The day after." What happened over the following 6 weeks was not dramatic. Drama, in my experience, is usually a sign that someone is trying to compensate for a lack of preparation. What happened was methodical. Diane worked with Phil to formalize documentation around the estate. Existing insurance policies were reviewed. The will, which Margaret and I had prepared together years earlier, and which had not been substantially updated since Daniel's wedding, was revisited. Margaret was well enough in May to sit at the dining room table for 2 hours with Phil Garretson. She wore the pearl-colored cardigan she liked, and she had her reading glasses on, and she went through everything with a precision that I recognized as the same precision she'd applied to every important decision of her life. She asked Phil 2 questions I hadn't thought to ask. She changed 2 things I'd assumed would stay as they were. Phil told me afterward, in the driveway, that in 30 years of estate work Margaret was among the clearest and most deliberate clients he'd encountered. I said I wasn't surprised. Daniel knew none of this. Renata knew less. In that same period, Renata called me twice and visited once. The visit was ostensibly about bringing a casserole. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who felt at home in a place she had no particular right to feel at home in. She asked about Margaret's prognosis with a concern that had the shape of concern without the substance of it. She mentioned briefly that she and Daniel had been looking at some things for the house. Future-looking things, she said carefully, which I understood to mean she had already begun cataloging. I thanked her for the casserole. I walked her to the door. I watched her silver Lexus back out of the driveway and turn south on Orchard Hill Drive. Then I went back inside to sit with my wife. There was a man in all of this who deserves mention, because this story isn't only about who let me down. There was a man named Vincent Kowalski, Vinny, who had worked beside me at Alderman Industrial for 19 years and who, from October through the following February, appeared at my house on Sunday mornings without announcement or invitation. He would ring the bell, hand me a bag from the bakery on a coarse road, and sit in the kitchen with me for an hour while Margaret rested. He didn't talk about the illness. He talked about normal things, his granddaughter's soccer games, a truck he was thinking of buying, the particular injustice of Michigan winters. He never once told me how strong I was or how well I was handling it. He just showed up. Every Sunday. I don't know if Vinny knows what those Sunday mornings meant. I've never been able to find the right words to tell him, so I haven't tried very hard, but they meant everything. The quiet, ordinary presence of a man who showed up because that's who he was. I thought about that often in the months that followed. About the difference between people who show up and people who show up when it benefits them. Margaret passed on a Sunday, August 14th. It was early morning, 5:22 a.m., just before the light changed, and I was in the chair beside her bed in the palliative suite at St. Catherine's, and she simply went. Without struggle. Without drama. The way she had lived. I sat there for a while after. The nurse, a young woman named Petra, came in at some point and stood quietly near the door, which I appreciated. She didn't fill the room with words. She let the room be what it was. I drove home in the truck as the sun was coming up over the flatlands east of Dearborn. The sky went orange, then pale gold. The roads were empty. I took the long way without deciding to. I will not describe the weeks after. Anyone who has lost the center of their life knows what those weeks are, and anyone who hasn't cannot be told. What I will say is this. Phil Garrettson called me on a Wednesday in September. He said the estate documentation was ready to formalize. He said there were some elements Daniel would likely find unexpected. He asked if I wanted to be present when Daniel was notified. I said yes. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon, October 6th, 2 o'clock, at Phil's office on Michigan Avenue. 3rd floor, walnut-paneled waiting room, a view over the street where the trees had just started to turn. Daniel arrived at 2:07. Renata was with him, which Phil had not explicitly invited but had anticipated. I was already seated when they came in. Phil's assistant, a man named Roger who had worked there for 12 years and had the demeanor of someone who had witnessed many of these conversations, brought water for the table and closed the door behind him. Phil opened a folder and began. He walked through the estate in sequence. The house, which I retained in full, Margaret having transferred her interest to sole ownership in my name via a quitclaim deed executed in May, fully legal, fully recorded at the Wayne County Register of Deeds. The retirement accounts, beneficiary designations updated and notarized. The investment account, designated to a living trust. Daniel listened with the expression of a man hearing things slightly faster than he could process them. Then Phil came to the jewelry provision. He explained, with the same measured precision he brought to everything, that Margaret had specifically itemized her personal jewelry collection, using the handwritten inventory notebook as the basis, and had directed that any pieces remaining at her death be held in trust for Marcus, to be given to him on his 25th birthday for the purpose of presenting to a future partner, should he choose to do so. Further, that any pieces previously removed from the collection without authorization, as documented in an attached exhibit, were noted in the record. The exhibit was 3 pages. It included a photocopy of the receipt from Carl Peretti's shop. It included photographs. It included a transcript of my March 3rd phone call with Renata, which I had recorded on my phone because Michigan is a one-party consent state, and I had looked that up on the evening of March 3rd. Renata looked at the exhibit. She looked at it for a long time. Phil said, "The estate is not pursuing civil action at this time. That option remains available to the executor, which is Mr. Holt, for a period of 3 years." He said it simply. He said it the way you state a fact. Renata looked up from the exhibit and looked at me. I looked back at her. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. Everything that needed saying was in the folder in front of her, organized in Phil Garrettson's clear and unremarkable type, recorded and dated and filed with the county. Daniel said quietly, "Dad." I said, "I know." And that was the whole of that conversation. They sat there for a moment, Daniel and Renata, in the particular stillness of people who have just understood something they cannot undo. Daniel was not a bad man. I want to be precise about that because it matters. He was a man who had chosen easy things for long enough that the easy things had become his whole character. He had chosen a woman who made him feel like the more impressive version of himself, and he had built a life around avoiding the kind of discomfort that builds people. He had not stolen anything. He had simply not been watching because watching required attention he'd found other uses for. Renata was the one who spoke first. She said, "Gerald, I want to explain." I said, "You don't need to." She looked at me. I said, "Renata, everything that needed explaining is in the file. I'm not angry. I'm just done." She blinked. She had prepared, I think, for anger. Anger is manageable. Anger gives you something to push against, something to defend yourself from, something to recharacterize later as unfair. What I gave her was nothing of the kind. I gave her the simple, flat fact of the situation. The jewelry had been inventoried. The transaction had been documented. The will reflected what Margaret had actually wanted, prepared and signed by Margaret herself on a Tuesday afternoon in May when she was clear-eyed and deliberate and present. What Renata had believed Margaret would have wanted was not relevant. What Margaret had, in fact, directed was in the file. Phil quietly gathered the second copy of the documents and slid it across the table toward Daniel. Daniel took it without looking at it. He was looking at me. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "What would you have done?" He didn't answer, because we both knew. He would have smoothed it over. He would have asked Renata for her explanation and accepted it. He would have split the difference and called it resolution, and we would have carried forward with the open wound of it covered in good intentions and nobody's hands ever fully clean. I had protected my wife from this while she was fighting for her life. I had protected the record of what she owned and what she wanted done with it. I had done it quietly, with the help of good professionals, in the hours between hospital visits and Sunday mornings in the kitchen with Vinnie from the bakery on Ecorse Road. She would have wanted us to, Renata had said. Margaret had wanted exactly one thing done with her jewelry. She'd written it down. She'd signed her name to it. She'd done it herself in her good cardigan, with her reading glasses on, at her own dining room table. No one had to interpret her. She'd already spoken. Renata didn't cry. I'll give her that. She sat straight and she absorbed it and she picked up her bag and she stood and she said to Phil, "Thank you for your time." Phil said, "Of course." She walked to the door. She paused, and she turned, and she looked at me one more time. I held her gaze. She left. Daniel stayed for another 15 minutes. He didn't say much. He asked a few logistical questions about the estate timeline, which Phil answered. When he stood to go, he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I believed him. I said, "Come see me. Come see your son." He nodded. He left. Phil closed the folder. Roger came in and cleared the water glasses. Outside the third-floor window, a single maple on Michigan Avenue had gone completely red overnight, the way trees do when you're not watching them, and were standing fully changed in the morning light while the rest of the block was still green. I drove home on a Thursday afternoon. I took Orchard Hill Drive the long way and pulled into the driveway at 4:19 and sat in the truck for a few minutes with the engine off. The house was the same house it had always been. White siding, black shutters, the garden Margaret had put in along the south fence in 2009 and tended every spring since. It would need tending. I would learn how. I went inside and I stood in the kitchen for a moment. The light at that hour comes in low through the window above the sink, amber and indirect, and it fell across the counter and the table and the two chairs that had always been there and would continue to be there. On the refrigerator, under a magnet from the Mackinac Bridge, there was a note in Margaret's handwriting from sometime last winter. A grocery list, mostly, but at the bottom she'd written, "Don't forget the good bread." I had forgotten it. Whatever week she'd written that, I'd come home without the good bread and we'd laughed about it and I'd gone back the next day. I stood there and I read it and I thought about what she told me once, years ago, after some long-forgotten disagreement with a neighbor that had resolved itself through patience. She said, "Gerald, the things that are really ours, nobody can take them. They either show up in the end or they were never really ours." She was talking about good faith, about the way honest effort tends, over time, to become its own protection. The pearl strand was gone. The sapphire bracelet was gone. 3 other pieces with names and stories attached to them, were gone because a woman with a key and an absence of conscience had walked into a room and made a calculation.